Namaste. Welcome to Insight UK podcast. We have a very special podcast as we inch close to the UK. To those who don't know what Remembrance Day is, it is a memorial day observed to commemorate the sacrifice of British and Commonwealth military and civilian servicemen and women in later conflicts. It marks the anniversary of the end of World War One hostilities, the 11th day on the 11th month in 1918. On Remembrance place at war memorials, cenotaphs, and churches across the UK. These include the laying of poppies, a 2 minute silence held at 11 a.m., and church bells ringing half. The red remembrance poppy, worn by many people, symbolizes the suffering and sacrifice. The day is a solemn occasion to honor those who have served and died in these wars. India's role in the war was significant. Over 1.3 million Indians fought in World War One in theaters across Europe, the Middle East, and East Africa, one of the largest in the Commonwealth and the most widespread. India over 15 billion pounds in today's money to the war effort, including 3.5 and 170,000 animals. And this is where, to know what the Mission Marigold is, we have a very special guest with us, Kumar Bala. Kumar Bala is an award-winning engineer, entrepreneur, and investor whose work spans and cultural innovation. A passionate advocate for India's civilizational heritage, channels his entrepreneurial experience into purpose-driven initiatives such as the India Pride, repatriate stolen Indian artifacts, and Mission Marigold, dedicated to honoring Indian soldiers who served in the two world wars. Welcome, Kumar Balaji, with us today on this very important and topical podcast.
Namaskar. Dhanyavad, Manuji. Thanks for that introduction. So, as Manuji mentioned, I have a whole range of projects that I get involved in. And I founded a few, of which Mission Marigold is one such vital project that is a grounds up attempt at recognizing the sacrifices and the contributions of the Indian soldiers to the two world wars. And for unfortunately, both of those, the narrative around those two wars generally tend to be Eurocentric, and very few historians talk about the contributions of the Indian soldiers. And this is a grassroots level community-led initiative on one hand to spread the information and to make the Indian diaspora aware of the contributions of the Indian soldiers, nearly 4 million fought in the two world wars, and on the other hand, get the official recognition and and a seat at the table during remembrance ceremonies all across Europe because of the contributions that were made by the Indian soldiers in those times.
So you've summed up the core vision and Marigold project. Can you tell us how did it begin?
Okay. So by 2016, there were increasingly attempts from both the Indian side and the British side on including more and more of the Commonwealth soldiers and their contributions in the Remembrance Day celebrations, out of which came the United Services of India initiative to nominate Marigold as the remembrance flower for the Indian soldiers who died since the First World War. And after that, a lot of high-profile leaders like the then Prince Charles, now the King Charles, and the Indian Prime Minister Modi have always used marigold as the flower of remembrance while laying the wreath or as a marigold pin in memory of the Indian soldiers. But at the grassroots level, for the last 10 years or so, not much has changed. Not many people were aware of these campaigns. And India remembers a project initiated by USA still remained as a very top-down initiative. It was being recognized in the official circles, and like for example, when the then Duke and Duchess of Cambridge went to India, they laid a marigold wreath at the India Gate. At the higher level, at the top-down governmental levels, it was well recognized that Indian soldiers need their recognition and their contributions need to be remembered. But at the grassroots level, not much had happened. So that was the primary reason why we started this project and why Marigold. United Services of India chose Marigold because Marigold has a historical significance to Indians. Marigold is always used in all our festivals, from birth to weddings to all sorts of festivals, and of course for remembrance as well, remembrance of our ancestors. So ideally, it became the right flower for the remembrance ceremonies as well. In Sanskrit, it's the Stula Pushpa, and in Tamil, of course, it is the Chamanti Poops. So the entire campaign felt like it's meant to recognize the contributions of people from the Indian subcontinent, of which many of whom were Hindus and Sikhs and Jains and Buddhists and of other faiths as well. So it's important that we chose a flower that matched with that cultural element of it, and I think marigold is the best choice that USI chose, and it then gave us the community the opportunity to use it as a flower of remembrance.
Wonderful. I was going to ask you that poppy is used for remembrance primarily due to its fields of World War One, particularly in Flanders, Belgium, and what flower, and you've explained it beautifully. So the other question that is already coming up media, it's a question being asked by many people. Some have in fact encountered it, in personal. People have asked that why is the need for a marigold pin? Why a separate flower or along with the poppy pin? The counter argument could be that the red poppy is inclusive of all things included.
Yes, that's an interesting question, and I think it needs to be addressed with the serious concern it deserves. A poppy is a noble symbol of remembrance, and it is widely seen across the Western Front. Hence, when this grassroots movement came to remember the sacrifice, poppy was the ideal flower of remembrance. But even within the poppy, there are different colors of poppy for different purposes. For example, pacifists choose to use the white poppy, and the purple poppy is used by, I think, those who want to recognize the sacrifices of animals that were involved in the First World War, right? And of course, the red poppy signifying the contributions of soldiers and the civilians who participated in the two world wars, right? But having said that, different countries have always had different remembrance flower. Say, for example, if you lived in France, you would use a different flower. If you lived in Germany, you would use a different flower. And if you lived in Israel, you would use a different flower. So each country has their own set of remembrance flowers, like India does now with marigold. It is not about either or, it is about both. It is about recognizing that the world wars, as the name states, was a global effort. A lot of people contributed to it, and a lot of people sacrificed their lives for the freedoms we enjoy. So it only then makes sense that each of those major contributors have their own way to remember the fallen soldiers, right? Why then India alone has a marigold flower while rest of the Commonwealth can uh, happy to use the red poppy? It's mainly because of the scale of involvement. The Indian subcontinent contributed the most to both of those wars outside of Britain for the British efforts and the Allied forces and the efforts of the Allied forces. It's often said that the Americans came in to rescue Europe from tyranny twice, but the reality is, from day one, Indians were part of the fight against tyranny in both those world wars. Unlike the Americans who joined late in the day, Indians were there from day one and fought shoulder to shoulder with their allies across Britain and France, and gave their lives to defend the freedom while they were fighting for their own freedom of their motherland back in Bharat, right? So why then marigold deserves the place amongst these other flowers, the flowers of remembrance flower of France, remembrance flower of Germany, and of course the remembrance flower of Israel, etc. The simple reason is the India's contribution, or the contribution of the Indian subcontinent, is tremendous. We were the largest volunteer army during the First World War. We then broke the record by being the largest volunteer army in the Second World War in human history. And our contributions to the war efforts in material and in financial contributions were among the top three to the Allied efforts. India gave one of the highest war loans to Britain in both those world wars. And in terms of materials, in terms of steel, and in terms of ammunition, in terms of coal, the contributions made by the Indian subcontinent is overwhelming compared to the rest of the Commonwealth. It is not to minimize the efforts of the other Commonwealth. Of course, everybody participated in this global effort, but the Indian contribution is so significant that it deserves its own remembrance and something that is culturally relevant to the Indian subcontinent. Hence, Marigold alongside poppy, and our case has always been that it's not an either or, it's not instead, it's always along with. So we've always argued that, as you can see, I'm wearing both the poppy and the marigold. It is this idea that the role of India needs to be remembered along with the role of other European powers. So if you were living in France, you would probably wear the French flower of remembrance along with the marigold. And if you are living in Germany, you would do the same with the German flower of remembrance along with marigold, and so on and so forth. And this is our point. It is not that we are trying to replace something. It is always about adding the extra aspect of it, which has for long been forgotten. And that requires a unique perspective into it. And marigold can be the symbol of that unique perspective.
Wonderfully explained. I mean, it's about, as you said, it's along with, and the scale of service and sacrifices of the Indian soldiers, hence that plus, which is along with the poppy, we wear this marigold. Brilliant. Of bravery and sacrifice of Indian soldiers, some historical facts about the involvement of in World War II, and why it is vital to remember their legacy today.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. Um, if you look at most of the modern discourse around the two world wars, you will notice that it is very Eurocentric. If you look at movies like Saving Private Ryan or Dunkirk, movies around those, it always shows or portrays the history as if it was a European conflict with mostly Europeans involved. But the reality is far from it. So if you talk to any British war historian or any European war historian about the two great wars, they will they'll agree with us that the two global wars, and particularly in the Western theater, was anything but that. There was a huge contingent of non-European troops based around the Western Front. Of those non-European troops, Indians were overwhelmingly the largest number of troops that fought in the two world wars. Not just in the European theater, of course, in North Africa, in Mesopotamia, in Southeast Asia, and of course within the Indian subcontinent as well. So a lot of historians have argued that the contemporary discourse around this needs to emphasize the contributions of the Indian soldiers. For example, we are going to celebrate the Battle of Somme, the 110th anniversary of Battle of Somme next year, and there is already a lot of initiatives around recognizing the fact that the Indian cavalry rode alongside the British cavalry in Battle of Somme. There are a lot of the Indian cavalry, not just the British Indian troops, but also the Indian troops from the princely states of Mysore, Bhaginagar, and Alwar, fought alongside the British cavalry in the Battle of Somme. The next year comes the 110th anniversary, and you will see more of what was the great contributions of the Indian soldiers and the Indian cavalry in the Great Battle of Somme, right, in the Western Front in France. And of course, one of the pivotal battles where Indians made a huge difference was the Battle of Haifa. Battle of Haifa is a significant battle towards the end of First World War, which effectively contributed to the armistice, which would eventually be signed later in the year. So Battle of Haifa was a crucial battle. The port city of Haifa was controlled by the combined forces of the Ottoman gunners and the German Navy. In this tough situation, to break the stalemate that was in the Eastern Mediterranean, the three Indian cavalries, not the British Indian cavalry, but the Indian cavalry from Jodhpur, Mysore, and Jodhpur, Mysore, and Bhaginagar decided to march head on towards the Ottoman gunners flanked by the British Navy, and they will broke through the defense of the German and the Ottoman troops, thereby liberating the port city of Haifa which will then break the stalemate in Eastern Mediterranean and make it possible for the establishment of the British Mandate of Palestine, which will then go on to become the modern state of Israel. So without the bravery of the Indian cavalry from those three Indian states of Mysore, Bhaginagar, and Jodhpur, the Eastern Mediterranean would not have been freed, and the stalemate would not have been broken, and we couldn't have had the armistice that we then had eventually in 1918, right? So that is a major significant contribution. And of course, Indians contributed to battles like Battle of Gallipoli, which the Allied forces could have won if not for the mistaking of the Indian soldiers by the British Navy. And eventually, I mean, Gallipoli is an interesting battle, because if initial part of the Battle of Gallipoli, the Australian and New Zealand corps were deployed, and they faced a hardship because they were not used to the terrain that was in Gallipoli. So the Indian reinforcement was brought out, and of which the Sikh and the Gurkha regiments were the most notable ones, and they turned the tide, and they were making tremendous progress in the southern city of Gallipoli. But unfortunately, because of the friendly fire from the British naval forces, Gallipoli would eventually go on to become a battle that the Allies would lose. But even those tricky battles, Indians contributed significantly. And another interesting fact, but that people may not know, is that one of the Indian regiments, the 89th Punjabi Regiment, was the most deployed regiment in the entire First World War, and I believe it is also the most deployed regiment till now. Sorry, battalion till now. Um, if you look at the theaters that they were deployed in, they were deployed all across Europe, from the Western Front to North Africa to Mesopotamia, all across the globe. They were deployed. Anytime the Allied forces needed to break through, this was the battalion that came to their rescue, right? So that's how significant they looked at the British Indian troops and the Indian troops, right? If you look at any report that comes that came out after the First World War or after the Second World War as well, it clearly states that held on until the Americans joined the war without the support of the Indian army and the Indian soldiers, right? So it is also interesting to note that towards the end of the Second World War, it is the loss of control of the Indian troops that will eventually go on to liberate not just India, but also Southeast Asia, and further liberating the world, right? So it is the Indian soldiers that were at the forefront of defending these European outposts. And once they lost the loyalty of the Indian soldiers, you eventually the world will become free, right? So Indians can proudly say that we're the only people who fought for freedom of both the European states and the non-European states, right? So it's when the Americans take leadership about being the leaders of the free world, what they're technically saying is that they were the leaders of the white European world and not the wider world. It is only the Indian soldier who fought for the freedom of all people, not just of the white Europeans, right? So that is uniquely attributable only to the Indian soldier. And when we come to the Second World War, and to personalize the conversation, there are so many valiant soldiers who fought from the Indian subcontinent that fought fought in both world wars. Of whom I think the my personal favorite is Kamal Ram. At the age of 19, he would volunteer to take on at the Battle of Monte Cassino in Italy, that there'll be a situation where the Allied forces need to cross a river, and it will be guarded by the German gunmen. So the Allied forces were looking for a volunteer who would go in and take out the German troops in one of those positions. Kamal Ram, to sheer bravery, a 19-year-old, would not just go on to neutralize one outpost, but he'll then further go on to neutralize three more outposts. And it was such a significant contribution to the Battle of Monte Cassino and the eventual liberation of Italy from the fascist forces. King George would personally go and award him the Victoria Cross in the battlefield, right? So we have the photographs of Kamal Ram receiving the Victoria Cross for his valiant efforts, right? So, and of course, we have General Kumar Mangalam, who again won a DSO, Distinguished Service Officer Award, for his contributions in North Africa. and he will then go on to become the Chief of Army Staff of the Indian Army post-independence. And it's also important for us to remember that these soldiers not just fought to liberate India and liberate the world, post independence, they also fought to defend India well into the 60s and 70s. So these were the soldiers, these were the same soldiers who made sure that India remained free post 1947. Every illegal occupation into India, either from the west or from the north, were defended by the bravery of these soldiers who still served in both Indian Army um, and in defense of the independent Republic of India. Right.
And in fact, you've hinted, or rather, you've touched upon the fact that they won so many, the highest of them, Victoria Crosses, and the stories are amazing. I mean, I have heard of they've even fought lions in the East African theater of war. Extremely important to remember their legacy, of course. My next question, spilling over. So, what was your personal drive for this mission? What inspired you to get involved? Once you've shared that, you can also touch upon what role do community groups or what role can they play in amplifying this message of Marigold Mission?
Well, that's an interesting question, right? So for me, I always found the Indian maxim "Satyameva Jayate," truth alone triumphs, as the rallying call when I look at any problem, right? Like, so when I came across this historical narrative being unfair and incorrect, I then spent a lot of time researching on it to figure out what has happened that this narrative has that we ended up with this sort of a narrative where the two global wars are being looked at primarily from a Eurocentric perspective. And the answer is a bit of a mixed bag, right? So if you look at why the Indian contribution to the two world wars were not so publicly discussed, I think most of the fault lies at our own feet more than anybody else. If you look at both Britain and France, they put in a lot of effort to remember the valiant efforts of the Indian soldiers, both in keeping meticulous records about the contributions of each and every soldier who fought in the two world wars, building memorials all across Europe, from Zegendorf to Neuve Chapelle, to Benin Gates, to Chatri, to of course the newly built Indian War Memorial Room at Sandhurst, the illustrious military training school in the United Kingdom. The Both Britain and France have put a lot of effort into preserving it, and even countries like Italy and Malta have maintained, and Egypt as well, have maintained the Indian War memorials in in brilliant conditions, right? So why then the general discourse uh, has never been about the Indian contributions to these two world wars? And I think it is mainly because of the type of leaders that came to power post independent India. They never saw the valor and the necessity of the Indian army, and they always tend to underplay the importance of these pinnacle events, right? So my view is that to change the narrative, we would need both a grassroots level organization and, of course, the top-down effort from the government to recognize the valiant efforts. And I saw that both, not just both governments, but the French government, the British government, and the Indian government have done a lot in bringing to fore the importance of remembering these sacrifices. I remember the speeches both by the British Prime Ministers and the French President Macron and the Indian Prime Minister Modi about the sacrifices of the Indian soldiers in the two world wars. Every time there is a remembrance event, and this particular topic comes about. But what was missing at the grassroots level? So the grassroots level, for some reason, the Indian community in Bharat, and of course the Indian diaspora in both the United Kingdom and the United States and across wider Europe, seldom took part in these remembrance events and even spent any real effort in discussing this with the wider public, right? So to break that, we decided that we need to do something about it. And being an engineer, I thought, okay, what can I do? How do I systematically then grow this into an organization that then can self-sustain um, and and speak and speak to the truth of the matter, right? So at the end of the day, it is about looking at history as it is and looking at the truth and the facts behind it. And fortunately for us, all three major nations that are part of this, the British, the French, and the Indians, have kept copious amounts of records and material that is already out there, that we don't have to do a lot of deep research to find out the numbers involved, the individuals involved, the individual personalities, and how it impacted the two world wars, right? So now the ball is in our own court. So it is up to us to make sure we learn about what the contributions of the Indian soldiers were, how significant it was, and what can we do to make this a mainstream conversation. I would like that in the future, when any movies or any sort of historical documentary is made about the two world wars, the Indian aspect of it is brought into the picture. You cannot have a movie like Saving Private Ryan where there is no Indian soldier at all. By 1941, by one account, one out of every three soldiers fighting in the Allied forces was Indian. So if you have one out of three fighting in a global war being Indian, and you seldom see Indian faces in movies and shows and documentaries about these world wars, then there's something wrong. And if you talk to World War veterans, I mean, interestingly, both my neighbors are they come from the British military background, and one of my neighbors, she was 18 during the Second World War, and she drove ammunition trucks. And that generation knew the contributions of the Indian soldiers. So one of the things that I find it always fascinating is when we attend any of these public events, public remembrance events, and Remembrance Sunday events, we always have people coming to us and either saying, "Oh, I served with the Indian forces in North Africa or in France or in other places." Or you have currently serving military personnel coming to us and say, "Oh, my grandfather served with Indian troops, my father served with Indian troops." Right? So there is so much of this oral history that is going to be lost once this generation passes away and there's no one to take on their legacy. To put it on a personal front, when we went to our local council to talk about how can we remember the sacrifices of the Indian soldiers, the person who organizes the Remembrance Sunday event, he told me that he's been looking for someone for the last 20 years to come out and take the ownership and really speak about the grand contributions of the Indian soldiers, right? So most British war historians have argued for the inclusion of the Indian soldiers in the two commemorations, right? It is only the Indian diaspora and the Indian community that now needs to take on the ownership and argue for the inclusion of the contribution of these millions of soldiers who gave their life for freedom while trying to free their own motherland, right? So it's something that is that needs to be talked about and to be set as a moral and ethical code for us to look up to. How these soldiers valorously fought to free the world while they were trying to free their own motherland, right?
Amazing. I'm very strong case of why we should all get involved and why this is very important. In fact, in many born Indians, they've mentioned that they never the role of the Indian soldiers in their schools, growing up and going to schools here in England, in Scotland, etc. And the fact that you mentioned that that generation, which is aware of the contribution for too long. So it's very important that we take this up and we take. Would you say, having seen what has happened in the last few years and with your mission, that there is some momentum which we have gained in the Indian diaspora, and momentum, or you think we will gain some momentum in the coming few years? What impact collective memory, especially thinking of the British-born, didn't even study about this in their schools growing up here.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, which is fascinating because even Indian-born Indians like us haven't read about this, right? So I remember the history of the two world wars being mostly about the German invasion of Poland in the Second World War and the assassination of Archduke in the First World War and all the dates associated with it, right? It was rarely mentioned that in India we're talking about history of the two world wars being taught to Indian school children, not mentioning the contributions of millions of Indian soldiers, right? Fascinatingly, the people who valorously argued for Indian freedom and spoke about the Indian contributions were mostly the British themselves, right? Like say, for example, Rudyard Kipling, who's not known for the pro-India views, but Rudyard Kipling wrote about the contributions of the Indian soldiers in the First and the Second World War, and of course, Anne Besant, in her case for India, wrote eloquently about without the Indian chest defending against the German invader, Britain cannot be free. So I'm of course paraphrasing her argument, but in her prose on this topic, she puts it out that while Indians fought for your own freedom, and you will not be patient to wait to be free, how do you expect India to be patient for her own freedom when the case for the Minto Morley reform came out and the argument was India needs to wait before it is liberated, right? So and of course in the Independence Day speech, if you look at Lord Mountbatten, he starts with who then became the Viceroy Mountbatten, who then became the first Governor General of India. He starts off by recognizing that he fought alongside the Indian soldiers and their valorous contributions to the two world wars, right? So, excuse me. So it is not just that the British students or the British Indian students didn't read about the Indian contributions in the two world wars. Even Indian students in India haven't read about it, right? So I think our stakeholders in education, primary and secondary, really need to look into this and make sure that the truth be told about the contributions of the Indian soldiers in the two great wars, and more significance, more to the point of how did Indians play a significant role in battles like Battle of Haifa and battles that were relevant for the Indian audience, right? Like the Battle of Gallipoli, Battle of Alamein. These are significant battles. So instead of focusing on battles where Indians didn't play a significant role, like for example the invasion of Poland by Germany, we should focus on battles where Indians played a significant role, which is relevant in terms of culturally relevant, and also students can then relate to these great episodes in human history. Instead of making history so boring that nobody wants to want to become historians, right? And when we get kids excited about history, then we would have more conversations about this in the public discourse. When we started Mission Marigold, there were only about half a dozen of us who were talking about this. This year, we have over 10,000 people across Britain, Bharat, and United States discussing this with their own families and friends, and also going to school assemblies and in their workplaces, arguing that we need to remember the valiant contributions of the Indian soldiers as well. In fact, it is spreading across the Commonwealth. For example, we've had a lot of conversations about how do we then take this message out to Canada, to Australia, and New Zealand. Particularly, if you look at the historians who talk about the Australian and New Zealand contributions to the World War, they often mention Battle of Gallipoli, because in the Battle of Gallipoli, it was the arrival of the Indian troops that will prevent the otherwise what would have been a disaster in terms of the Anzac troops during the Battle of Gallipoli, right? So the Australian historians always remember this because Gallipoli is an important aspect of Australian and New Zealand remembrance ceremonies. Like the Anzac Day, they talk about Battle of Gallipoli, and they always mention that it was the arrival of the Indian soldiers that really saved the day, even though it wasn't an outright victory. It was able to pull out without a lot of casualties, right? Uh, so it is important that not just Indians living in Bharat and Britain talk about the Indian contributions, but Indians living all across the world. For example, I know that in Belgium, there are Belgian locals who still keep on the tradition of going and laying wreaths at the Indian war memorials in Ypres and in Benin, while Indians in Belgium are not aware of it, right? So it is fascinating that the Belgians themselves have taken the effort to remember or at least keep alive the memory of Indian soldiers who stood against the German troops to defend Belgium. So if you look at there are some really fascinating posters that were published during that era, and you have Belgian kids dressing up as Indian soldiers that just to taunt the German soldiers. So it was the arrival of the Indian troops in Belgium to take on the German army that then coalesced into this liberation force in Belgium, right? So it is interesting that Belgium remembers it, and even Italians do remember the contributions of the Indian soldiers in Battle of Monte Cassino, and of course in Malta as well. Whereas Indians ourselves, we haven't. So I think the time has come for both Indians in India and the Indian diaspora, the Indian expats globally to learn more about the contributions, and it is growing, and it's growing significantly. To answer your question, we've grown from half a dozen in 2020 to almost 10,000 people volunteering to go and speak to the public and to lay wreaths during Remembrance Sundays and go to school assemblies. We were hoping that by next year we could have a bigger campaign, thanks to people like, thanks to organizations like Insight UK, Global Hindu Federation, and lots of other organizations like the British Association of Physicians and British Association of Allied Health Professionals. So they're all now working with us to get the message out so that next year it'll be grander than what we've done in the last 5 years, right? So initially when I started this, I told myself that we'll do this for 10 years. We'll do our utmost best to get it to a state that it's self-sustaining. Like if you look at the poppies, it is a self-sustaining movement, right? Like, so you go anywhere within the United Kingdom during the month of November, you will see poppies all across the country. You will see them in supermarkets, you will see them in street lights, you will see them in parks, you will see them at the entrance to towns and cities and villages, right? So it became a self-sustaining movement. Eventually, I would want India to do the same with Marigold, at least in India, right? So when events like Pahalgam happens, we remember the soldiers and their contributions and the significance of the Indian Army. But once the events end, we generally tend to not remember the sacrifices that the Indian Army did to protect us and to protect the freedoms that we enjoy, right? So having one day in a year remembering the contributions of the Indian soldiers is really important. And I believe the 11th of November is the right day to do it because it is the signing of the armistice of the First World War that for which India fought, the Indian soldiers fought valorously. So I think 11th of November would be a good day to not just remember the soldiers, uh, not just remember the two world wars, but from an Indian perspective, to remember the contributions of the Indian soldiers since the First World War who have given their lives so we can enjoy our freedom today. Even now, one of the largest contributors to the UN peacekeeping force is Indians. So Indian armed personnel are placed all across conflict zones in Africa who are now defending civilians valorously from militias, right? So if you look at UN report on the contributions of the Indian peacekeeping force, every 6 months they speak gloriously about the contributions of the Indian peacekeeping force, right? Because they're the most professional, they're the most brave. They've defended against a lot of these militia attacks on the civilians over the course of the last few decades. But it's seldom discussed, and I think Remembrance Day would be a good time to talk about the contributions of the Indian soldier in keeping the world free and in keeping India safe. And I think that is a good way for the civilians to tell the Indian soldier that we applaud and we support and we remember the sacrifices that they make day in and day out, serving in one of the most hostile places on the planet. Like if you look at some of the outposts that our soldiers stand and guard us at the moment are horrendous in terms of the weather, right? Like it's extremely cold, extremely hot, but they stand there and defend our freedoms. And it is only fair that we remember them at least once a year for all the sacrifices that they make.
Absolutely. I mean, you've made a very passionate cause of us claiming our legacy. In fact, I'll give you a personal anecdote that I saw the German flag of Jammu and Kashmir Rifles captured in East Africa during World War One. It's in Jammu city in Satwari, and that really moved me. I mean, I've done as well as there is a book called "I Can Never Say Enough About the Men" by traces the his the contributions and what the in World War One, and it took a It took an Englishman to recognize that and write, as most of my community members have no idea of what they went through and the contribution. So I think you make a very, very passionate cause that we need to do more. We need to claim the Belgians, remembering the Indian soldiers in Belgium. It should be the Indian and so on and so forth everywhere. Um,
And
Having said that,
just to add to that point, right? So if you look at Israel, every year they celebrate the liberation of port city of Haifa, and the hero of Haifa is Dalpat Singh. So Israelis celebrate the liberation of port city of Haifa by the three Indian cavalry, the Jodhpur, the Bhaginagar, and the Mysore cavalry, but we ourselves don't, which is frustrating that such a pinnacle event in human history that we have forgotten. Most of us aren't even aware of the contributions of these three cavalry in liberating the Eastern Mediterranean and thereby bringing about peace across the world, right? Like at the end of the contributing directly to the armistice that was later signed in the year, right? So it's only fair that we are taught the true history of what happened rather than this myopic view of those who inherited the power in 1947. Those who inherited power in 1947 did not think that the Indian army was a crucial aspect of the Indian nation state. And then they faced the brutality of the real world when the invasions happened, and they soon realized that without the strong Indian army, India cannot be free, and the contributions of the Indian soldiers need to be remembered in that context. That this naive view about pacifism and the idea that somehow satyagraha won us the passive resistance and civil disobedience won us freedom is anything but the truth, right? So historically, the reason why India became free is the sheer fact that the loss of loyalty of the Indian soldier meant that the colonial empires were no longer possible. And it's the Royal Indian naval uprising that solidified the Indian position that India ought to be free. And of course, Britain signs into act which effectively ended up in the Indian independence, right? So it is important that we remember those sacrifices. And without the Indian army, we would not be free today. So it is just the plain truth.
absolutely. So my final question to you, Kumar Balaji, is that what are some of the ways, I mean, some practical steps that individuals and communities here in the United Kingdom can actively participate in Marigold Mission during the upcoming Remembrance Day? What give us some things that we can do.
Indeed. So I think three things we should do. The first one is to wear a marigold, which is pretty simple. Either get a marigold print that we've distributed through partners like Insight UK, or you can buy them online. If you can't find one, let us know. We'll be able to send you a link. We've distributed over 6,000 marigold prints this year, and we're hoping that we'll do more next year, and we'll start early in the year as well. Number two, ask your local council if they are happy for us to lay a wreath on behalf of the Indian soldiers. And most councils, from our experience, have been far more than welcoming. They've actually grabbed us by both hands, and they've always wanted to do this. And finally, they'll have somebody taking the lead and doing it, right? So we've been doing that in our council for the last 5 years, and it's been tremendous, the sort of support that we've got from the wider community. The third thing is speak to the schools. If you're parents of young children, ask your schools, the primary and secondary schools, whether you can come in and talk to the kids about the contributions of the Indian soldiers during the Remembrance Week. So we're doing that with a few schools across Buckinghamshire this year. We hope that eventually we can have a program that we can give out to parents who can then have a set of slides that are specific for primary school and a set of slides that are specific for the secondary schools. And you can go and talk to kids about this tremendous contribution of the Indian soldiers during the Remembrance Week. And schools have always been welcoming. Every school around Buckinghamshire that either we approached or they approached us, they've been calling us year on year to come and do the assemblies because they think that it's a vital message in a pluralistic society to be truthful and honest about what happened in history, right? So that's the third. And the other thing that you could do is to talk to your colleagues at workplaces and try and broaden the conversation about the conversations around remembrance about the contributions of Indian soldiers in these world wars. It is important now more than ever because the anti-Indian and the anti-Hindu sentiments have been rising across the West. If you look at this, is primarily more of an American problem than the British problem. You will see a lot of these public intellectuals claiming that the Americans who fought for freedom did not celebrate Deepavali, for example. There's a famous Twitter handle that talks about how those who fought for liberating the world were always predominantly American, which is not true. It rarely happens on the British side, because in Britain history is taught much more truthfully, and it covers a whole array of contributions, right? And schools are more than welcoming to talk about these topics. But this counter narrative against India needs to be challenged. And one way to do that would be to talk about the contributions of the Indian soldiers in liberating Europe, in liberating Belgium, liberating France, liberating Italy, and even liberating Germany in certain cases, right? So Europe is free now because of the sacrifices of the Indian soldier from day one. Unlike the Americans who joined both world wars at the end of the two conflicts, right? So we didn't need to be convinced to fight for what is right or fight for dharma, right? So it is important that we keep these three in mind. Wear a marigold to remember the sacrifices of the Indian soldiers. See if we can lay a wreath during the Remembrance Sunday event on the 9th of November. And every year it is the Sunday closest to the Remembrance Day, the 11th of November, that Remembrance Sunday is, um, um, you'll have Remembrance Sunday. And of course, the third one is speak to schools and workplaces to see whether you can discuss that either in a school assembly or as a newsletter for employees at workplaces. This way, we can do what we can from a grassroots level to get the information out and to right or wrong, and bring truth to this historical perspective about the two world wars.
Thank you so much, Kumar Balaji. I think this is a clarion call to all of us. I mean, Sanatan Dharma, one of the most important tenets is gratefulness, kritagyata. So this is us being grateful to the sacrifices and contribution of our soldiers, Indian soldiers on such a wide scale. Amazing stories, and we have to be our own storytellers. We have to tell our own story. We cannot wait for someone else to come and do the job for us. So, and you've given some very easy, practical ways for each one of us to get involved. It doesn't require too much effort. It's very easy, and there is no excuse not to do it. So, hopefully, we will see with your efforts and with the communities joining in, with so many other organizations, including ours inside UK joining in, we'll see this momentum only gaining in the coming days, and especially this particular week leading up to Remembrance Sunday. We hope to see more participation from the community. So,
Indeed. You hit it on the nail. The two of our epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, are both wartime epics. And one of our holiest books that we refer to all the time is Bhagavad Gita. It is the conversation between two warriors about what is Dharma. So people always, this is a tendency that Indians tend to have, that we are a wounded civilization, to quote Naipaul on this. But we might be a wounded civilization, but we are also the only surviving civilization of the classical antiquities, which have preserved its identity. The ancient Greeks have all gone, the ancient Romans have all gone, the ancient Persians have all gone, the ancient Aztecs have all gone, but it is only the Indians. We still hold on to our tradition, and it is only because of the warriors that have stood for Dharma, right? So that is why it is important to know that our perspective on life and the thing that our ancestors held dearly are the two wartime epics of Ramayana and Mahabharata, and of course, Srimad Bhagavad Gita, which is a conversation between two warriors about what is Dharma, right? So how much more obvious can this be? How much more clarion call do we need to remember the sacrifices of the warriors, right? So I think it is only our duty to remember them.
brilliant. And thank you so much once again. And I thank the audience who is listening to this podcast. And I'm sure that they will be stepping out and doing something, playing their bit in thanking the contribution, tremendous contribution of the Indian soldiers. And I hope they write back and tell us what they have done for Remembrance Sunday this year. Thank you, Kumar Balaji, and thank you, everyone. Namaste.
Dhanyavad, Manuji. Dhanyavad.